Can a single crate of potatoes topple a 2,000-ton steel giant? It sounds like a maritime myth, but for the SS Eastland, it was a chilling reality. Long before the screams filled the Chicago River, this speed queen was hiding a fatal instability, where just a few misplaced crates of cargo could transform her into a deathly pendulum teetering on the brink of disaster. On the 24th of July 1915, 2,500 people stepped into a festive dream, unaware they were boarding a vessel balanced on a razor's edge. Why did a ship designed for elite performance become so fragile that a minor shift in weight could seal the fate of hundreds? Was it a freak of engineering, or something far more sinister hidden in the ship's dark past? Today, we are performing a forensic autopsy on a disaster that should never have happened, exposing the moment where human greed collided with the laws of physics. What was the invisible killer hiding in plain sight that no one dared to stop? Stay with me until the very end. Because the answer isn't just about a sinking ship, it's about a betrayal that turned a calm dock into a graveyard. Chicago at the dawn of the 20th century was a city forged in fire and steel, a booming industrial furnace fueled by the sweat of immigrant labor. But for the exhausted workers of giants like Western Electric, the only reprieve from the soot and clangor of the factories was the cooling breeze of Lake Michigan. This desperate hunger for weekend leisure created a literal gold mine for shipping magnates. In this era, a fierce and unregulated rivalry raged between the Dunkley-Williams Company and the Michigan Steamship Company. Victory in this maritime war was measured not in safety records, but in knots and passenger counts. Speed was the ultimate marketing tool. The faster the ship, the more excursions it could run in a single holiday window. It was within this toxic environment of profit at any cost that the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company made a fateful acquisition. They did not purchase the SS Eastland because she was a masterpiece of naval engineering or a paragon of stability. They bought her because, in the brutal logic of maritime commerce, she was a bargain. The owners were intimately, perhaps criminally, aware of the Eastland's reputation. In the slang of the Great Lakes sailors, she was cranky, a term used for a vessel that lists unpredictably, feels tender underfoot, and refuses to right herself with the confident buoyancy expected of a massive steamer. Yet, in the sterile world of corporate ledger books, these warnings were secondary to the biological tax. The goal was to extract the highest possible revenue per square foot of deck space. Packing 2,500 souls onto that vessel was never a matter of service. It was a cold, calculated risk where the only collateral was human life. The tragedy of the Eastland was written into the ship's DNA as early as 1902 at the Jenks Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron. The original construction contract was a technical death trap of conflicting requirements. The owners demanded a top speed of 20 miles per hour to outrun every competitor on the lakes. Simultaneously, they demanded a draft of only 12 feet so the ship could slide into the narrow, silt-clogged harbors of the Great Lakes without grounding. In the uncompromising realm of physics, speed requires a long, sleek hull, while stability in a shallow draft vessel requires a wide, heavy base. You cannot have both without sacrificing the ship's metacentric height, the distance between the center of gravity and the center of buoyancy. The Jenks engineers attempted to defy these laws, creating a vessel that was essentially a high-speed knife edge balanced on a shallow tray. Even her birth was marked by a crisis of identity. Originally intended to be the city of South Haven, a legal dispute over naming rights led to the fallback name Eastland, a trivial but haunting omen for a vessel that never quite fit the physical world it was built to navigate. Technically, the Eastland was an architectural monster. Standing 265 feet long, she was topped with 3 towering heavy wooden decks. This made her significantly more top-heavy than any other vessel in her class. This narrow and tall design created an alarmingly high center of gravity. To compensate for her inherently tippy nature, the ship relied entirely on a complex, archaic, internal ballast system consisting of 10 steel tanks. However, the engineering here was fundamentally flawed. The intake pumps were sluggish, and the internal plumbing was so poorly routed that water flow between tanks was inconsistent. It was a manual system that required a genius-level understanding of the ship's rhythm, something the harried crews of the era rarely possessed. For more than a decade, the SS Eastland carried within her hull a desperate maritime warning that was never heeded. From her maiden voyage in 1903, the Speed Queen of the Lakes proved to be anything but majestic. In reality, she was a mechanical failure in constant conflict with her own design. Despite the aggressive contract requirements for 20 miles per hour, she rarely hit her targets, her engines groaning under the strain of a hull that fought the water rather than gliding through it. She frequently struck sandbars and mangled her propellers in the river mud, but these were merely surface-level symptoms of a much more violent instability lurking beneath the waterline. The first major tremor of the coming massacre occurred in July 1904, barely a year into her service. While carrying 3,000 passengers, an overcapacity even then, the ship suffered a heart-stopping list of 12 to 25 degrees in open water. On deck, it was a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. Unsecured furniture slid across the polished wood, and panicked vacationers scrambled toward the high side to avoid being pitched into the cold depths of Lake Michigan. Again, in August 1906, the Eastland repeated this terrifying performance on the Chicago River, listing so severely that local authorities were forced to intervene, temporarily slashing her passenger capacity. To any sane maritime engineer, these were not accidents. They were loud, physics-based screams that the ship's center of gravity was dangerously high and her stability was non-existent. The owners, however, chose to treat these terrifying mechanical hiccups as mere quirks or the nature of the beast, blinded by the massive revenue the Speed Queen generated. Nowhere was this instability more absurdly or more dangerously demonstrated than in the historical footnote known as the Potato Mutiny. While the name sounds like a joke, it serves as the ultimate forensic proof of the Eastland's fatal flaw. During one voyage, a relatively small group of passengers rushed to one side of the ship. Some accounts say they were eager to see a passing vessel. Others suggest it was a spontaneous, playful movement. The mere weight of this small group, roughly equivalent to a few dozen crates of potatoes in the grand scale of a 2,000-ton steel vessel, caused the massive giant to lurch and tilt uncontrollably. In a stable ship, such a movement would be imperceptible. On the Eastland, it was an existential threat. This event was laughed off as another cranky moment. In reality, it was a technical smoking gun. If a weight as insignificant as a few dozen people could compromise the integrity of the entire hull, then the Eastland was no longer a ship. She was a time bomb on the water, simply waiting for a crowd large enough to trigger the final fuse. Rather than admitting the ship was fundamentally unsafe or undertaking a total structural redesign to widen the hull, the owners engaged in a series of Band-Aid in a misguided, unscientific attempt to lower the center of gravity They shortened the ship's massive smokestacks. While this removed some weight from the top, the gain was negligible. Simultaneously, in an act of staggering engineering incompetence, they poured tons of heavy concrete onto the upper decks to facilitate repairs and tile work. In the brutal mathematics of naval architecture, they were unintentionally stretching the pendulum. Every pound of concrete added to the upper decks pushed the center of gravity higher, making the ship even more hypersensitive to the slightest movement of people. They were trying to fix a sinking foundation by adding weight to the roof. In 1912, the sinking of the RMS Titanic had sent a shockwave of grief and fury across the globe, leading to a desperate, unrefined scramble for maritime safety. The public demanded action, and in 1915 the United States government responded with the La Follette Seamen's Act. The slogan was politically unassailable: lifeboats for all. It was a law written in the blood of the Atlantic, intended to ensure that no passenger would ever again be left without a seat in a survival craft. But this law, crafted for the deep, unforgiving reaches of the open ocean, would be executed with lethal irony in the shallow, muddy waters of the Chicago River. To comply with this federal mandate, just weeks before the fateful Western Electric excursion, the Eastland's owners were forced to install additional lifeboats and massive, heavy life rafts. These survival tools, weighing several additional tons, were bolted onto the hurricane deck, the highest possible point on the ship. For a vessel already struggling with an impossibly high center of gravity and a flawed, sluggish ballast system, this was the final, lethal blow. The irony is as sharp as a razor and twice as deadly. The law intended to prevent another Titanic actually guaranteed the Eastland massacre. The Eastland had been transformed into a top-heavy cage. She was a vessel whose stability had been legislated away by politicians who didn't understand the physics of the Great Lakes. The Speed Queen was now a 265-foot pendulum that had been pushed too far past its breaking point. The stage was set, the tickets were sold, and the tragedy was no longer a possibility, it was a mathematical certainty. On the morning of the 24th of July 1915, the LaSalle Street dock in the bustling heart of Chicago was not merely a transit point. By 6:30 a.m., the air was thick with the humid anticipation of the annual Western Electric Company picnic. More than 7,000 employees and their families had converged on the riverfront, creating a vibrant, shifting sea of white linens, starch-collared shirts, and straw boater hats. The SS Eastland, long marketed as the Speed Queen of the Lakes, sat low in the murky, slow-moving waters of the Chicago River. Commanded by Captain Harry Pedersen and overseen by Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson, the vessel appeared majestic to the untrained eye, but to the river's seasoned pilots, she sat with an ominous, heavy posture that hinted at the structural instability lurking beneath her freshly painted hull. As the boarding process commenced, a fatal synergy of human psychology and flawed naval architecture began to align. The Eastland was uniquely vulnerable to crowd surge. The ship was top-heavy. As thousands of Western Electric employees streamed across the gangplanks, they instinctively moved toward the starboard rail, the side facing the dock, to wave final goodbyes to friends and onlookers, carrying a concentrated shift of hundreds of tons of human weight. For a stable vessel, this would be a routine operational variable. For the Eastland, it was the first tremor of a terminal structural failure. By 7:10 a.m., The ship had officially reached its legal capacity of 2,500 passengers. Historical records and later testimonies suggest the actual number may have been significantly higher, as the holiday rush led to a chaotic and perhaps negligent tallying process. The vessel began to develop a persistent, sickening list toward the starboard side. The ship's metacentric height, the critical measurement that determines a vessel's ability to right itself, was failing. The righting leverage that should have pulled the hull back to equilibrium was virtually non-existent. Deep in the sweltering, thunderous bowels of the engine room, Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson felt the floor incline. In a desperate bid to stabilize the ship, Erickson began pumping river water into the port side ballast tanks. He intended to create a counterweight to the crowd on the starboard rail. However, he was fighting against an archaic, sluggish pumping system, a relic of 1902. The pumps groaned and labored, but they could not keep pace with the shifting human tide above. This left the ballast tanks only partially filled during a critical, deadly window of time. This specific technical failure triggered what naval architects call the free surface effect. In the hierarchy of maritime disasters, a half-full ballast tank is a captain's greatest enemy. The water inside does not act as a stable weight. It acts as a liquid sledgehammer. Because the tanks were not pressed up, the water was free to surge violently across the floor of the tanks with every minor tilt of the hull. Every time a group of passengers moved, the internal tide of the ballast water followed them with terrifying momentum. The Eastland was no longer a ship. She had become a 2,000-ton steel cage being swung by an internal liquid wrecking ball that her narrow, shallow draft hull was never designed to absorb. Between 7:15 a.m. and 7:20 a.m., the situation spiraled into the point of no return. The starboard list became so pronounced that the crew began to panic. Then, the inevitable overcorrection occurred. The ship suddenly and violently lurched away from the dock toward the center of the river, a portside list that sent a literal chill through the seasoned harbor pilots watching from the shore. Pedersen and Erickson were now fighting a mechanical phantom. As the ship leaned toward the river, the thousands of passengers on the upper decks felt the floor incline beneath them. Their natural instinct was to scramble toward the high side to compensate and stay upright. This human reaction created a catastrophic snapback effect. The weight of the crowd moving starboard, combined with the surging, uncontained water in the portside ballast tanks, created a torque that the ship could not withstand. Instead of righting itself, the Eastland began a slow, agonizing, and sickening roll back toward the port side. By 7:23 a.m., the list reached a critical 10 degrees. Below deck, the sounds of ragtime music and laughter were instantly extinguished, replaced by the discordant, bone-chilling crash of heavy mahogany furniture, the shattering of thousands of pieces of glassware, and the first ripples of genuine primal terror. At this precise moment, the disaster transitioned from a mechanical failure into an atmospheric horror. The Eastland's design featured several low-slung gangways, large loading doors on the side of the hull. Because the ship was sitting so low in the water due to the weight of the crowd and the botched ballast pumping, these openings dipped below the waterline as the portside list deepened. Thousands of gallons of the Chicago River began to pour into the hull. The river wasn't breaking in. The ship was effectively drinking the river through its own open mouth. While the water rushed in at a rate of tons per second, a secondary, man-made horror was unfolding in the darkness of the lower decks. Chilling survivor testimonies and subsequent investigative reports revealed a detail that would haunt the city of Chicago for a century. Several of the iron gates and internal doors separating the passenger decks had been locked. The reason was a tragic and mundane piece of maritime bureaucracy. The crew wanted to ensure that tickets were properly collected, and that passengers did not wander into higher-class sections or restricted areas before the voyage officially began. When the ship reached a 25-degree tilt, these locked corridors were instantly transformed into vertical death traps. Passengers on the lower levels found themselves staring at the ceiling as the floor beneath them became a sheer wall. Those who rushed toward the exits found only cold, unyielding iron bars. Mothers were pinned against these gates by the sheer, crushing force of the panicked crowd and the rising icy river water. They watched helplessly as the exits remained barred, their hands reaching through the iron grates for a surface that was rapidly disappearing. The Speed Queen had been turned into a floating prison, where the very walls designed to organize the holiday journey now acted as the bars of a mass grave. The people trapped in these cages had no path to the upper decks. They were sealed into a steel tomb as the ship began its final, irreversible roll. The final collapse occurred in the 3 minutes between 7:25 a.m. and 7:28 a.m. At 7:25 a.m., the laws of physics finally achieved a total and merciless victory over human engineering and corporate greed. The list hit 45 degrees, and the ship's metacentric stability vanished completely. Inside the grand dining salon, a massive, multi-ton refrigerator, unsecured and top-heavy, broke free from its moorings. It slid across the deck like a battering ram, crushing dozens of passengers who had been huddled against the wall for safety. On the upper decks, the scene was one of pure chaos. Thousands of people were pitched into the water as if they had been thrown from a collapsing mountain. Those inside the hull were tumbled into a dark, suffocating heap of bodies, splintered furniture, and jagged debris. By 7:28 a.m., a mere 15 minutes after the boarding process had concluded, the SS Eastland settled on its port side in just 20 feet of water. She did not disappear into a deep-sea abyss. She simply rolled over in the river mud, her starboard hull still visible, dry, and mocking above the surface. To an observer on the LaSalle Street Bridge, it looked like a grounded whale. But for the 844 souls caught behind locked gates, pinned under shifting furniture, or drowned in the sudden, violent rush of water into the lower cabins, the shallow depth of the Chicago River might as well have been the bottom of the Atlantic. The festive pendulum had finished its final lethal swing. The air was filled with nothing but the sound of churning water, the frantic, high-pitched whistles of nearby tugboats, and the muffled, fading screams of those caught in the steel cages below. The massacre was complete. The forensic trail led directly back to a decade of ignored warnings, a potato mutiny that was laughed off, and a 15-minute window where every safety measure, every bureaucratic rule, and every law of naval architecture failed at once. The Eastland succumbed to the weight of her own flaws, taking 844 lives with her into the silt. As the SS Eastland settled into the river mud at precisely 7:28 a.m., the rescue effort was instantaneous, driven by a primal, desperate energy, yet it was tragically chaotic. The tugboat Kenosha was the first to reach the site, heroically racing through the murky water to pull alongside the exposed, dry starboard hull of the Eastland. It acted as a makeshift steel bridge, allowing hundreds of terrified passengers on the high side to scramble to safety. On the shoreline, bystanders, horrified, by the sight of thousands of people struggling, screaming, and drowning in the oily water, began throwing anything that could float: wooden fruit crates, chicken coops, and torn planks of wood. But for the souls trapped inside the steel skin of the ship, the world had already become a dark, airless tomb. The scene below the surface was a literal hellscape of mechanical and human entanglement. Divers and fire crews arrived to find a nightmare that defied the logic of shallow water rescue. Because the Chicago River was only 20 feet deep, the ship did not sink away into an abyss. Instead, it remained a looming metallic presence, trapping its passengers in rapidly shrinking pockets of air and rising silt. When the final, agonizing count was tallied, the numbers were not just staggering, they were a condemnation of an entire era. 844 lives were lost in a matter of minutes. It was far more than a maritime disaster. It was a deep, jagged societal wound that would never fully heal. The demographic data reveals the true scale of the devastation. 22 entire families were wiped out of existence that morning, leaving no one behind to mourn them but the city itself. The immigrant communities of Chicago, the Czechs, Poles, and Germans who built the city's industrial backbone were decimated. Among the fallen was a 7-year-old boy named Willie Novotny, who would later become famously known as Little Feller. Identified only by the tag on his clothing, Willie became the haunting, silent face of the 229 children who perished. His story underscored the brutal reality that the Eastland didn't just kill individuals, it systematically erased the future of a generation. However, the tragedy of the Eastland did not end in the muddy waters of the river. It moved into the sterile, oak-paneled courtrooms, where a different and perhaps more sinister kind of physics of failure took hold: the catastrophic failure of the American justice system. In a move that stunned the grieving public, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company hired the most formidable legal mind in America, Clarence Darrow, to defend the officers and owners. Darrow, known for his rhetorical brilliance and ability to sway the coldest of juries, skillfully pivoted the narrative. He didn't argue that the ship was stable. Instead, he framed the disaster as a freak accident, an act of God, or a result of unforeseeable circumstances, effectively shielding corporate greed from criminal accountability. Despite the overwhelming forensic evidence gathered over the previous decade, the terrifying list of 1,904, the documented instability of the 1,906 incident, the potato mutiny, and the clear mechanical failure of the sluggish ballast pumps the legal system offered a massive shield to the powerful. The owners utilized the Limitation of Liability Act of 1851, a maritime law originally designed to protect honest ship owners from the unpredictable, catastrophic losses of the high seas. In the hands of Darrow and the company's legal team, this law was weaponized. They successfully argued that the liability of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company should be capped at the post-accident value of the vessel. The resulting valuation was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty. After the costs of salvaging the rusted, mud-caked, and blood-stained hull were deducted, the total value of the once proud Speed Queen was appraised at a measly $46,000. For the families of the 844 victims, this was a final, devastating slap in the face. The final verdict, delivered after years of litigation, ruled that the sinking was an unforeseeable accident and that no negligence could be proven against the owners or the engineers. Not a single corporate officer spent a day in prison. The 844 lives lost, the 22 families erased, and the hundreds of orphaned children were reduced to a mere line item in a bankruptcy filing. After the lawyers, the salvage crews, and the administrators were paid, there was virtually nothing left for the families of the victims. The biological tax that had been calculated in the corporate ledgers years before was finally collected in full. The law ensured that the owners did not have to pay a cent more than the weight of the scrap metal that had served as the executioner for so many. The Eastland massacre remains the deadliest naval disaster in Great Lakes history. But its true legacy is not found in the physics of the roll or the failure of the ballast tanks. It is found in the cold, calculated way the system refused to pick up the pieces, proving that in 1915, the weight of gold was far heavier than the weight of 844 souls. The Eastland didn't just capsize, it revealed a society where profit was the only cargo that truly mattered. The story of the SS Eastland did not conclude with the settling of the river mud or the closing of the bankruptcy ledgers. The vessel that had become synonymous with death was granted a remarkable second life. In 1916, the United States Navy purchased the rusted, blood-stained carcass for a mere fraction of its original construction cost, while the public and the press saw a cursed ship or a jinx of the lakes. The Navy's engineers saw a hull with untapped potential that had been fundamentally misused. They towed the ship to a dry dock and performed the radical structural surgery that the original corporate owners had stubbornly refused to fund. They ruthlessly cut away the towering, top-heavy upper decks, the very platforms that had acted as a lethal lever in 1915, and stripped the interior of the heavy, unsecured luxury furniture that had crushed so many victims. Commissioned into the Navy as the USS Wilmette, the vessel was transformed into a gunboat and training platform. For the next 30 years, spanning from the closing days of World War I through the entirety of World War II, she patrolled the Great Lakes and served as the training ground for thousands of naval recruits. During this period, the vessel was noted for being stable, reliable, and remarkably seaworthy. In fact, the Wilmette became one of the most successful and longest-serving training ships in the Navy's inland fleet, eventually being sold for scrap in 1947 after nearly half a century on the water. This peaceful existence of the USS Wilmette provides the most chilling and definitive forensic evidence of all. It proves a grim truth. The ship was never cursed by supernatural forces, nor was its basic hull design inherently evil. When the Navy restored the vessel to its intended draft and removed the predatory, top-heavy additions of the corporate owners, the laws of physics were no longer its enemy. The 844 people who perished on the 24th of July 1915 were not victims of a jinxed ship. They were victims of human interference and systemic negligence. The Speed Queen only became a killer when man decided to cram extra decks for passengers and bolt heavy lifeboats to its highest point to satisfy a bureaucratic checklist. The USS Wilmette stands as a silent, decades-long witness to the fact that the Eastland disaster was a 100% preventable crime of engineering and corporate greed. As we close the file on the SS Eastland, we are left with a composite of systemic failure. It wasn't a single error that killed 844 people, but a perfect storm of compounding mistakes. It began with a flawed original design that prioritized competitive speed over fundamental stability. This was exacerbated by an archaic, sluggish ballast system that proved incapable of fighting the free surface effect. And, most ironically, It was the rigid safety regulations born from the grief of the Titanic that added the final, lethal weight to the hurricane deck. It remains one of history's most bitter tragedies, a scenario where the mandated cure for one disaster became the primary poison for the next. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Eastland's legacy is the architecture of silence that surrounds it. While the Titanic and the Lusitania have been immortalized in the global consciousness through endless cinema and literature, the Eastland is often treated as a mere local footnote. Today, on the busy LaSalle Street Bridge in downtown Chicago, thousands of people walk past a small, unassuming bronze plaque every day, completely unaware that they are standing on the site of the deadliest maritime disaster in the history of the Great Lakes. The city, perhaps eager to distance itself from the shame of the legal betrayal and the lack of corporate accountability that followed the sinking, allowed the memory of those 22 extinguished families to fade into the murky depths of the river. The Eastland is a masterclass in the catastrophic consequences that arise when human ambition outpaces ethical oversight. It is a cautionary tale regarding the danger of one-size-fits-all government mandates and the cold-blooded calculation of corporate ledgers, where human life is a secondary variable. Today, as we stand on the threshold of a new century defined by rapid, often unregulated technological expansion from AI to private space travel, the ghost of the Eastland speaks to us. We must ask, are we building new Eastlands today? Are we rushing into these new frontiers with the same blind pursuit of profit, trusting that our regulations, which invariably run a decade behind the technology, will be enough to keep us safe? History is not merely a collection of shipwrecks and tragedies. It is a mirror that reflects our own systemic vulnerabilities. The Eastland teaches us that when we ignore the physics of failure in favor of the physics of profit, the bill will always come due, and it is rarely the owners or the decision-makers who pay it. We must remember Willie Novotny and the 843 others, not as cold statistics, but as the human price of a lesson we are still struggling to master. The next time you witness a miracle of modern engineering or a new piece of safety legislation, look closely at the ballast. Ensure the foundation is sound, and make sure the pendulum isn't already starting its final lethal swing. Finally, before we conclude today's message, thank you for honoring these 844 souls with your time. If this investigation moved you, please like, share, and follow for our upcoming documentaries. Your engagement ensures these histories are never forgotten. If you have a personal story or a maritime mystery that haunts you, share it in the comments. Let's keep the conversation alive. See you in the next voyage.